Hello and welcome to the course on negotiations. My name is John Torrens, and I'm a professor of entrepreneurial practice at Syracuse University's Whitman School of Management. I am also the deputy department chair for the Department of Entrepreneurship and Emerging Enterprises, and I'm the program manager for our Masters of Science in Entrepreneurship. And it is my pleasure to be here with you to talk about negotiations. So, we're going to talk about negotiations and deal making in a very classical sense. I'm going to base this lecture on some of the content in Harvard Business School Essentials on negotiations. So, you can check that out. There's a digital copy as well as a print copy if you're interested in it. And throughout the lecture, it's a really good idea if you have a deal or an upcoming negotiation in mind. So that way you can apply what I'm talking about to your upcoming negotiation. That seems to be a pretty effective way to go about learning about these things. So let's get started. So to start, there are two types of negotiations, and they're very different in the way you approach them. The first is distributive. So a distributive negotiation is one where the parties compete over the distribution of a fixed sum of value. And the key question in this type of negotiation is who will claim the most value. So in this case, a gain by one side is made at the expense of the other, often referred to as zero sum. And you see this in a lot of hard driving negotiators. They feel like for them to win, the other side has to lose. And there's a place for this type of thing. But as you will see, there's a lot more to be gained if you take a different approach, and that is an integrative negotiation. And this is a negotiation in which the parties cooperate to achieve maximum benefits by integrating their interests into an agreement. And these deals are all about creating value and claiming it. And the best integrative negotiations increase value for both sides. So, for example, in a distributive negotiation, this might be something as simple as buying a used car. Right? You have a price in mind. That's your budget. You want to get the best possible value for that budget. And the seller of the car knows what he or she wants to get for the car, and they want to get as much as possible. So if you're the buyer, every dollar you concede is a win for the seller. Likewise, if you're the seller, every dollar you concede is a win for the buyer. Now, in an integrative negotiation, the goal is to try to increase the total pie of value. A good example of this is a compensation or salary negotiation. Actually, compensation, not just salary, because compensation in general implies this integrative approach. So, if it were purely distributive, the employee might go in having a certain number in mind, and every dollar he or she concedes is a win by the employer, and vice versa. That's strictly distributive, right? A win by one side results in a loss by the other. However, if you think of it in a more integrative fashion, whereas maybe I'd like a certain number in terms of salary, but I'm willing to take a little bit less salary in exchange for extra paid time off, or maybe a higher expense account, or extra work from home benefits, or something like that. So if you ask for those things instead of just straight up salary, your employer may feel that he or she is also winning a little bit by conceding or giving up something that maybe isn't as valuable to them, but is valuable to you. So sometimes we have a tendency to approach negotiations in a very distributive manner. But my challenge to you today is to think about the deals you're making and the negotiations you're getting involved with and see if there's a way to turn them more integrative in nature, because in that way you'll create and claim much more value for yourself, but so will the other side. All right, so again, a couple examples of distributive negotiations. We talked about the sale of the car, but in this case, it's the sale of a carpet. So a buyer and the seller, they don't know each other. There's really no relationship, and that's key in distributive negotiations. There's really no expectation that you're going to have a long-term ongoing relationship. And really all that matters is the price, right? You don't really care about the relationship. You don't care about anything else except the price. And each side haggles for the best deal. So every gain by one party represents a loss to the other. You see this a lot in open air flea markets, and or if you've traveled overseas or something like that. People like to bargain and haggle, and that's a distributive negotiation. Another one might be a wage negotiation between business owners and their union employees. So the owners know that any amount conceded to the union will come out of their own pockets, and vice versa. So again, in a purely distributive negotiation, the value at stake is fixed. Usually it's dollars, and each side's goal is to get as much of it as they can. So consider the example of the two people negotiating over shares of a freshly baked pie as an analogy. So each aims to negotiate for the biggest piece of pie possible, knowing that any concession made by one party will reduce his or her share by an equal amount on the other side. So yeah, if I claim just over half of the pie, the other side is going to get just under half of the pie. So it's a zero sum. So to succeed in a distributive negotiation, and again, this is probably the least complicated type of negotiation, but still there's some tactics that you can employ. Now, you may have heard in negotiation or deal making mythology that you should never speak first, right? I've heard of this a lot, and even in my early entrepreneurial days, I kind of clung to this, right? Because I'd heard it somewhere, I don't even remember where, but somebody said, he who speaks first loses. So that just stuck in my head, and I used it for a while until I actually started practicing and digging into the literature. And the research is pretty clear that that's just a fallacy. So the first offer actually can become a really strong psychological anchor point, and it's one that sets the bargaining range. So if you read the research, studies show pretty clearly that negotiation outcomes often correlate with the first offer. So start at the right place. Don't feel bashful, or don't be afraid to make the first offer, because what you're doing is you're setting the stage and you're setting the range. And that's an important tactic. It's known as anchoring. Next, don't disclose any significant information about your circumstances, including why you want to make a deal, your real interests or constraints, your preferences, nothing like that. Don't even disclose at which point you'd walk away, or what we call the reservation point. It can be to your advantage to let the other side know that you have good options if this deal falls through. And that's something called BATNA, or best alternative to negotiated agreement. We'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, you don't want to disclose any information except your BATNA. Also, it's really good to have information about the other side that can benefit you. So learn as much as possible about the other side's circumstances, their preferences, why they want to make a deal, what are their real interests, what are their constraints, if they have any preferences or anything like that. So for example, I actually used this a little while ago. I was looking for a new mountain bike. I went on Facebook Marketplace and I found a guy who was selling a decent bike at a pretty good price. So I just kind of, I looked up this guy on Facebook, and I saw that he had done a few mountain bike races and he likes to build bikes. And I saw a post on Facebook where he had built this particular bike that I was looking at buying for his dad, and his dad didn't ride it, so he just wanted to unload it. It wasn't a bike that he rode. He didn't like full suspension. He liked what they call hardtails with no suspension in the back. So he wasn't going to really ride this bike, and he just wanted to get it out of his garage. So knowing that, I kind of went in, thinking, well, he really doesn't want this bike and I could use it. So I went in a little bit under his asking price, and we were able to make a deal because he just wanted to unload the bike. And for me, if I didn't make the deal, I would have just gone to the next bike on Facebook Marketplace. So that's an example of just exploiting what I learned about the other side in setting the first offer or demand. And interestingly enough, he didn't even counter, which is, to me, signals that maybe I should have went a little bit lower. But in any case, I got an amazing deal on this bike. Another important thing is not to overshoot, right? So if you claim aggressively or greedily, the other side might just walk away or not even take you seriously, and you'll lost the opportunity to make a deal. So even though in a distributive negotiation, price is usually the only thing at stake, And we did just say that making the first offer is a good way to anchor. You also want to make sure that you're not going overboard and anchoring too high or too low, depending on if you're the buyer or the seller, because that could just crater the negotiation before it even starts. So there is a little bit of a balance there, and you can solve for that by doing your research on what the thing is worth and what the other side's motivations, perceptions, and limitations are. Integrative negotiation, as an example, and again, this is taken right from Harvard Business Essentials book on negotiations. So let's take the case of Gomez Electronics and one of its primary suppliers, Kraft Components Company. They're negotiating an agreement under which Kraft will build and deliver 10,000 switches over a period of 6 months. Now, Gomez is interested in getting the lowest possible price, but is likewise interested in maintaining a long-term relationship with Kraft. And this has been an innovative and reliable supplier over the years for them. Kraft's sales manager would like to maximize the price of what his company receives under the contract, but they want to be mindful of the relationship as well. He'd hate to lose this long-term customer. So, as long term partners, each side is willing to disclose some of its interest to the other. And that way, if one party must give ground on price, the other party might be able to offer value on some other front. So, hopefully, you're recognizing this type of exchange when it comes to one of your customers or vendors, because it's important not to go to the mat with somebody every single time thinking that it's just a distributive negotiation and the only thing that matters is price. And I think there's a tendency to do that among a lot of people, especially if you're really aggressive. Um, but just think it through, because sometimes the relationship is much more valuable. So in the bottom here, it says, together, the two negotiators settle on an agreement that gives Kraft what it wants, $2 per switch. But in return, Kraft agrees to give Gomez Electronics 60 days to pay instead of the usual 30-day agreement. So the extra 30-day float actually helps Gomez by reducing its working capital requirements, right? Because it lengthens out its AP cycle. So it lowers its working capital requirements over the term of the agreement. And further, the two firms agree to collaborate in designing a new set of switches for a Gomez product currently on the drawing boards. So both parties got something of value to them. In this case, Kraft got the price they wanted, but Gomez got a deal that was going to ease their cash flow a little bit. And a nice byproduct of this exchange was that they're going to collaborate on a new design for a set of switches. So you could see that there's a way to raise the value or raise the tide, or what's the saying? A rising tide raises all boats, right? So that's kind of what an integrative negotiation is. So how do you find mutual benefit in an integrative negotiation? Well, we'll talk about 6 ways here. So the first one is to provide significant information about your circumstances. Next way is to explain why you want to make the deal in the first place. Then talk about your real interests or business constraints. Then reveal and explain in general terms your preferences among issues or options. Then consider and reveal any additional capabilities or resources that you might have that meet the other side's interests and could be added to the deal. And then use what you learn to find creative options that will meet the interests of both parties. To the greatest extent possible. Sometimes you're not going to be able to make too much headway there, especially if your interests are too divergent. But in general, if you sit down ahead of a deal or a negotiation and you think about these points, you're going to make a better deal for yourself and for the other party. And when that happens, the synergy that results can often benefit both sides more than the agreement that was just made. So as an example, let's take the example of maybe you're a young company and you're really looking to hire some technical talent, right? Maybe let's just say you're looking for a full stack developer or coder for your business or a new division of your business. Now, previously you didn't need one, but now you do. You're in the early stages, so cash is tight. You don't have a lot of it. You've got a little, but you want to keep some dry powder for whatever comes next. So let's just say that the situation here is you're an early stage founder looking for a technical addition to the team. You don't necessarily want a co-founder because you want to keep as much equity as possible. You're willing maybe to give up a little bit, but the key here is you really need this technical person on board to develop whatever you need developed so you can get to market. Okay. So if you're the founder, you might actually sit down with the person you're interviewing and explain the situation, right? You might want to disclose that, hey, we're in startup mode. We've got a couple early customers based on our MVP. They've given us some feedback. We know what we've got to do, and now we need a technical member of the C-suite here to join us. We don't have a lot of money. I'm willing to give up a little equity for the right person. And you can explain why you want to make a deal and just say, look, we really need a good person on board here. So that way we can get this thing developed and execute on some of these potential deals we have with customers. Likewise, the technical person you're hiring might come and say, hey, look, I've had several offers from big companies. The salary is really good, although I don't necessarily want a 9 to 5. They don't have a great work from home policy. I don't really want to be in the office all the time because I've got young kids, and I'd rather just work from home a little bit. So I'm willing to give up a little salary in exchange for that type of flexibility. But the reality is I've still got bills to pay, so I still need some money, and I'm not really interested in that much equity. Just because my life is such that I need cold hard cash to pay bills. I'm not interested in waiting 5 or 6 years for my equity to be worth anything. So you kind of have this conversation, right? Maybe the employer thinks about it and says, hey, I hadn't really thought about it, but I'm fine giving this person some flexibility and working from home. Maybe they can work from home most of the time and just come in a few hours a week for meetings. I mean, this is a technical position where they're going to be coding heads down. So maybe it's not that important that they're in the office all the time. So you concede that. And by conceding that, it's a good faith effort, and the potential employee gets that and says, all right, well, this person's playing nice with me. Maybe I'm willing to give up a little bit of my salary requirements, but I really want a review in 30 or 90 days. And after that review, I want to know what my potential bump in pay is going to be, and so on. So you can see through this exchange, through both sides' preparations, the give and take, what one side really wants, what the other side really wants, what each side is willing to concede if it means gaining more of what they really want, and so on. So hopefully you're thinking through a deal that you've made or a deal that you've got to make or some upcoming negotiation, and you're thinking about how can you claim and capture as much value as possible while also enabling your opponent or collaborator, if you want to consider it that way, to also do the same. We've talked about the two types, or the two basic types of negotiations. Let's talk a little bit about deal-making complexity. So in a two-party negotiation, like I'm buying a carpet or you're selling a car, or maybe it's a boss subordinate during a compensation review. That's just one side and another. Relatively, I don't want to say easy, but there's just less information to grab. And there's plenty of examples of two-party negotiations. Many negotiations that you get involved in and have just one other person in the party. Next phase would be this multi-phase deal or negotiation. And this is where one deal could lead to the next, kind of in the example we just talked about between Gomez and Kraft. They agreed on a price and longer terms for payment, but then they're also going to collaborate on the design of a future switch. So that's a really good example of the idea that, hey, this deal could just set the table for future deals. In my life, this has happened a few times where my company. So, for example, we're trying to get a contract with a new county. My company provides services for young kids with disabilities through early intervention, preschool special education programs through Department of Health and Department of Education. Sometimes counties have enough providers, they don't want any more. And I'll go in, and if I get that kind of resistance, I'll suggest that, hey, why don't you give me a list of the areas in the county that your current providers just don't like to go, maybe because they're too far out or they're perceived as too dangerous or whatever the reason is. And I say, well, I'll see if I can meet that demand. And if we do it satisfactorily and you like what we do, then maybe you'll consider opening up the rest of the county for us. And that's worked several times for me really well, where we make a deal for one thing, we get to prove some performance, and we go on to the next phase of the deal. And like I said, that's worked pretty well. So what types of multi-phase deals are you involved with? Or have you been involved with? And can you see how the first phase of the deal set the stage for subsequent deals? And then you've got multi-party transactions. So this could, a good example of this, let's say, real estate development or redevelopment, right? There's a case that I talk about in my 1 week intensive course in New York City on negotiations. It's the World Trade Center rebuilding. So Larry Silverstein had bought the World Trade Center shortly before it was taken down on 9/11. He had a $10 million a month payment to make to the bank, and he had no building and no rent. And he was really motivated to get the building rebuilt. But because of how emotionally charged that event was, it wasn't just Larry Silverstein negotiating with builders to try to rebuild his building. He also had government agencies and families of the victims to contend with. I mean, there were a lot of interests in this site. So, some people thought, well, we can't rebuild on that site. It's sacred ground. Other people thought we have to rebuild on that site to show that we're resilient. And then there were very strong feelings on the design of the building. And the owner, Larry Silverstein, he had to take into account all of these different views and manage the priorities of various coalitions in order to get his building built. If you're interested in that whole scenario, there's a great movie called 16 Acres, made by a friend of mine, Mike Marcucci. And you could find that probably on YouTube or Hulu or something. But it does a great job of detailing Larry Silverstein's journey trying to get his buildings rebuilt. Let's talk now a little bit about what you need to do before you start negotiating a deal. And I know that there's probably, some times where you just have to walk into a negotiation fairly cold without much preparation. But hopefully you're at the point in your entrepreneurial journey or your business journey where you have time to prepare. And this is really important. So the amount of time you take to prepare and the quality of your preparation has a direct correlation with the outcome of the deal. So let's talk about a few key concepts. The first is your BATNA, and that's your best alternative to negotiated agreement. And also know that of the other party. So if you know what your BATNA is, right, that also helps you understand your reservation point or when you walk away. Because if the negotiation is getting close to being equal to your BATNA, then you really don't have much more to lose. You could just set that as your reservation point and walk away. So, for example, let's use a salary negotiation. So let's just say, one of your key employees came to you and said, hey, look, I need a raise. I've been doing a lot here and I'm a key member of the team. And, I want a 15% bump. I mean, I know you've been normally doing 4 to 5%, but I think I'm that valuable and I think I'm that important. Now, as the employer, you can look at your BATNA as well as the BATNA of the employee who's trying to negotiate a salary increase. So your your best alternative to a negotiated agreement is to either hire a new person to backfill this position because the person you're negotiating with is left, or maybe you've got a really strong high performer who can come in and fill this role and you don't really have to train them as much because they know the organization and the history and the company. So your BATNA is just to promote from within or go back to market and find somebody else. One may be more preferable to you than the other, but that's for you to decide. Now, for the employee trying to figure out his or her BATNA, you could think about, well, all right, this person wants a 15% bump. They're already at this level of compensation, and you probably know the competitive landscape. in your industry, and you know that, hey, if they go back out on the market, they're not going to get what they're asking for from me anywhere else. So, maybe their BATNA is just to take whatever deal you give them, and be happy with it. Now, on the other hand, if you know this is a high performer and there's headhunters looking to poach this person, and this person is contributing a lot, you might look at the 15% bump as peanuts compared to what the person's bringing to the table. And you might think, well, my BATNA here is not as good as giving this person what they want. So I'm going to do it. Now, if you did decide to do that, another thing to put in place would be to say, hey, you're getting 15% now, but we're not having this conversation again for, another year or two, or whatever the period is you're comfortable with. So that's your BATNA. So know what your BATNA is, because that often sets your reservation point. Reservation point is the point at which you're willing to walk away because the deal no longer makes sense. And this is really important. It's so easy to get caught up in the game of the negotiation and just wanting to make a deal so badly that you go past your reservation. So if you're the buyer, just make sure you know what price you will not go above. If you're the seller, make sure you know what price you won't go below. And also, because you're hopefully thinking of more integrative negotiations, think of all the other ways you're willing to add value to the deal and capture value. So it's a really important discipline. Make sure you know your reservation point and you're willing to walk away when that happens. And in a real good integrative negotiation, if you get down to the end, you can disclose that too. Say, hey, look, we're at my reservation. So this is my best and final. I can't go higher, or I can't go lower than this. And that's a perfectly logical thing to do when it's a distributive negotiation. But again, it's a discipline. I know a lot of people who claim to be really great deal makers because they make a lot of deals, right? They close a lot of deals. And because of that, they think they're great deal makers. The problem is the deals they're closing are just terrible deals, either because they've gone past their reservation point and they haven't captured much, if any, value for their organization or themselves, or because they just basically that's it, right? They've passed their reservation point. So just because you make a lot of deals and close a lot of deals doesn't mean you're a good deal maker. It just means you close a lot of deals. The question is, are these good deals? And how close to your reservation point are you? And the other side of that is, how close to your anchor are you? So the better you set your anchor, the more likely you are to be far away from your reservation. All right. So the next concept we want to talk about is ZOPA, and that's zone of possible agreement. So that means the zone of possible agreement is from the buyer's reservation point, right, at the lower end, to the seller's reservation point at the higher end. So, and I'll show you an example of this in a minute, but creating and claiming value by switching from distributive to integrative is also a really great idea. I mentioned this earlier. So even if it's something as simple as buying a car, is there something else you can do to sweeten the deal? So back to my example of the mountain bike that I bought. One of the things I did that I probably didn't even need to do was tell the guy that he could keep the pedals on the bike, because I use a completely different shoe that wouldn't have even fit the pedals he had on there. So I offered a lower price and I said, hey, if you want to, you can keep the pedals, just as a concession. But to my surprise, he's like, no, I don't need the pedals. That was my dad's bike, so you can have them. So I actually conceded something that I never had to give up. So now I've got a set of pedals that I could use if I want to, or sell, or something like that. But it was a way of switching from a distributive agreement where it was just the price for the bike was the key factor, to integrating something like, hey, you can keep the pedals if you want to. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about BATNA, your best alternative to negotiated agreement. Knowing your BATNA gives you the confidence to negotiate the best deal. And you should always be working to improve your BATNA. Always. Even if you're in the middle of negotiations, wherever you are, you should be constantly thinking of ways to improve your BATNA. You should identify the other side's BATNA as well. And when possible, work to weaken the other side's BATNA. I mean, of course, in an ethical way, right? So if I'm an employee and I want to have a salary negotiation with my boss, it might be a really good idea for me first to go out and interview with some competitors and maybe even get an offer and say the offer's higher. I can come into my employer with the negotiation. And if it isn't going my way, I could say, hey, look, by the way, I've got this offer from a competitor and it's really attractive. I don't necessarily want to leave this job because I love this company, but I do need more compensation. So I'm willing to do it if I can't get it here. All right. So that's an example of constantly improving your own BATNA. Likewise, working to weaken somebody else's BATNA is important to the extent that you can. And again, you don't want to do things that are underhanded or illegal or unethical, but if you could arrange things in such a way that decrease their BATNA, that's really helpful for you. So back to, if I'm an employee, we'll use that example. Maybe one way that I could ethically weaken the other side's BATNA, in addition to getting an offer from a competitor, I could be taking on more and more responsibility and becoming less and less disposable, right? So the BATNA for my employer, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement would be to see me leave and he or she has to replace me. Well, now that doesn't seem as attractive because I'm so important. I'm so ingrained in the organization. I've got all this responsibility and I'm doing well. So I've improved my BATNA and weakened theirs a little bit because now by being so important, it's not as tenable for them to lose me. So that's an example of how you might weaken somebody else's BATNA. So let's talk about reservation price. So here's an example again from Harvard Business Essentials. So in this example, you're currently paying $20 per square foot for suburban office space. Now, the location is pretty good, it's satisfactory, and you believe that the price is fair, but you wouldn't mind paying more to be closer to your downtown customers. While preparing to negotiate with a commercial landlord for an office lease in a downtown high rise, you decided that you would not pay more than $30 per square foot, and that's your reservation price. Now, if the landlord insists on more, you can walk away and attempt to lease space in a different building, or you can stay where you are at $20 per square foot. That's your BATNA, right? So you're paying $20 a square foot. You're thinking, hey, if I could get closer to my downtown customers, I'd pay up to 30. That 30 is your reservation price. But if you can't strike a deal with somebody downtown at 30 or under, your BATNA is just to go back to paying $20 per square foot. Now, at the end of a lengthy negotiation session, the landlord declares that he will not accept less than $35 per square foot and he won't budge. In this case, that is well above your reservation point. So if you're employing discipline, you graciously terminate the negotiation and you walk away from the deal, right? That's an example of how to walk away or why to walk away when your reservation price has been passed. All right, so back to ZOPA, zone of possible agreement. All right, so here you can see in this case, well, here we're talking about a building here, right? So the seller's reservation price is $250,000. So in other words, the seller is not able or not willing to take less than $250,000. The buyer's reservation is $275,000, right? So he's done his research or she's done her research and she said, all right, the building is worth about this, and I'm willing to pay $275,000 for it for whatever reason. It could be location, it could be the design, it could be the layout, whatever it is. So here's an example. So the buyer says, what would you say to an offer of $225,000? I could agree to that. So if you notice, that's an anchor, right? So the buyer's reservation price is $275,000, but they anchor at $20,000 less than that at $255,000. Now you notice it's not an overly aggressive or obnoxious anchor. It's only $20,000 off of their reservation price. Now, if you're the seller, you say, all right, that's above my reservation, but that was the very first offer. Maybe I can get a little bit more out of it. So the seller says, thanks, but I believe the building's worth more and I can get more if I leave the building on the market for another month or so. You should recognize that as BATNA, right? The best alternative to a negotiated agreement at $255,000 is just to leave the building on the market another month and see what you get. Now the buyer says, well, maybe, but maybe not. All right, tell you what, I'd be willing to pay $260,000 now if we could reach an agreement. And the seller says, well, $265,000 and it's yours. The buyer says, all right, then $265,000 it is. All right. So you can see that in both cases, they did pretty well. They were beyond their reservation price, right? The seller got $15,000 higher than his or her reservation. The buyer bought it for $10,000 under their reservation. So they made a deal within the ZOPA, or the zone of possible agreement, and they're both probably pretty happy. Now you can see the first thing that happened was the buyer set an anchor. The seller could have taken that because it was above the reservation, but they tried to claim a little more value and said, well, I'll tell you what, my BATNA is X, right? So they disclosed a little bit about their BATNA. So that the buyer takes that into account and says, all right, tell you what, maybe leave it on the market for another month and get another 5K. What if I do that right now for you? And the seller says, yeah, maybe, but why don't we make it a little bit higher? And then the buyer just takes it. So there's a couple volleys back and forth, but you can see that the final price there, 265, is pretty much right in the middle of the ZOPA. So let's talk about creating value through trades. All right. The magic here is satisfying the other side at little cost to you. So let's take a few bullet points here. So for a supplier, that greater value might take the form of an extended delivery period. For the customer, having deliveries spread out during the month might be of no great consequence, but for a supplier with strained production facilities, it may be very important, right? So it's no skin off my back. And it means a lot to you. All right, great. Let's add that to the deal. And now you've sort of banked a little goodwill and can reasonably claim a little bit more value for yourself. Now, let's say for a customer, greater value at low cost might take the form of 3 months of free repair services if needed, right? Because I don't have a repair person on staff and I don't want to spend extra money repairing it. And for a vendor, you've got such great confidence in your products and it's not going to need any repairs during that period. So this free service is of zero consequence, right? So providing it to the customer, you incur zero cost because you're so confident. Now the customer values the repair service highly because they don't have the expertise and they don't want to spend the money. So this is a really good example of how the vendor concedes something of little value to them and the customer gains something of value in this exchange. So this is a really good example. Now, how about for another department in your company? Greater value might be found in your offer of 2 high-powered workstations that your people rarely, if ever, use. And that department may be able to offer something in exchange that you value more than it does. So yeah, maybe these 2 high-powered workstations are valuable, but maybe kind of using this conference room that you guys never use is valuable to us, right? So it's a little bit of a trade. Maybe for an employee, the opportunity to work from home office a couple of days a week may produce great satisfaction while costing the employer nothing. That's a very easy thing to trade off. So another real world example, I love this one. This is an example of, I think it's Allstate Insurance. Now, don't quote me on that. It might be Geico, but it's some sort of car insurance company. And one of the things they offer is this rapid response team, right? So if you buy insurance, car insurance from this company, and when you buy insurance, you're really concerned about price, right? Because insurance is insurance for the most part, and you're not really thinking about all the other things they might offer. But this company offers what's called a rapid response team. So if you get in a car accident in the middle of the night in a driving snowstorm in Syracuse, New York, it may be of great comfort to you to call this number and have the response team come there. And they get a guy to come out in the middle of the night in the snowstorm and they check to make sure you're okay. Do you need an ambulance? Let's get you a tow truck, all this kind of stuff, right? Now, you don't know about that value before you sign up for the insurance, but once you experience it, you're so happy and you probably wouldn't go anywhere else. The key thing here is that the insurance company is providing that service to you. And even though, yeah, it costs a little bit of money to have somebody meet you in the middle of the night in a snowstorm to help you out, it's actually decreasing their costs significantly. Think about it for a minute and see if you can figure out how that actually works, right? Why would an insurance company who's notoriously cheap right? Because they don't make money by paying claims, right? They make money by investing prepaid premiums and watching them grow. But why would they do that? And the answer is because by spending the money on this rapid response team, seeing if you need an ambulance, getting you a tow truck, and that sort of thing, they've assessed the situation and they've done a great job of reducing fraud. So the insurance company sends somebody to the scene of the accident. They ask if you need an ambulance. And if you say no, you go home. And the next day, when the personal injury attorney calls you and says, "Hey, do you need, do you need some representation?" You've already told the insurance company that you feel fine, you don't need an ambulance and all that kind of thing. Also, when you go to the shop and maybe the damage was to the front right quarter panel, and the guy at the shop says, "Hey, well, you got a little dent back here, I can just throw that into the claim." The insurance company knows that that's not where the accident was because they've surveyed the vehicle, talked to you, and maybe even helped you with the police report. So it's a really good example of the insurance company providing a service that, yeah, it costs them a little bit, but it saves them so much more on the back end in terms of reducing fraud. All right. So let's talk about 9 steps in deal preparation. All right. And hopefully by the end of this, you're realizing that, maybe you're a pretty good deal maker and a good negotiator, but if you take some of these concepts and put them into practice and prepare a little bit and apply some discipline, you may be able to be a much better negotiator. So step 1, think about what a good outcome is for you, and go one step further and think about what's a good outcome for the other side, right? Obviously making the deal, but of course they've got to get terms that work for them. Step 2, identify potential value creation opportunities. So again, in the employment situation, it could be compensation, it could be profit sharing, it could be incentive bonuses, it could be work from home, it could be expense reimbursements on equipment, whatever it is. Think of ways to create value in the deal and be that rising tide that lifts all boats. Next, make sure you know your BATNA and your reservation price, and also make sure you know these things for the other side. So what is the other side's BATNA? What's the other side's reservation price? That helps you set the anchor. It helps you bring in other things to create value in the deal, and hopefully results in a better deal for everybody. Constantly work to improve your BATNA. And it's not mentioned here, but of course, do what you can in a legal and ethical way to weaken your opponent's BATNA. The next thing is anticipate the authority issue. So, are you negotiating with the decision maker? Right? That's a really important thing. If not, you'll approach it in a different way. You could maybe be more aggressive. But at the end of the day, you want to make sure that this person who doesn't have the authority feels comfortable enough bringing it to the authority in order to make a deal in the first place. Next, learn all you can about the other side. What's their motivation? What have they done? What's their BATNA? What's their reservation price? Other deals they've made? Any constraints? Have they been in the news? All that stuff. Learn as much as you can. You'd be surprised at what you could learn. Even like from things LinkedIn, Facebook, those types of social media platforms, you can really learn a lot about the other side. Next is prepare for flexibility in the process. It rarely, if ever, goes the way you think it's going to. I think, I forget who the quote is attributed to. I always hear that it's Mike Tyson, but for some reason, I think it's somebody else. But, it goes, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face, right? So you have a plan when you walk into the negotiation, and then something happens, right? Like you didn't expect that their BATNA was as high as it is, or you didn't expect them to set an anchor as aggressive as they did, or whatever. Or you didn't realize it was a competitive process where they're also negotiating with somebody else. So prepare for flexibility in the process and just be ready for it. Next, gather external standards and fairness criteria. So this could be, macro industry or macro market data, right? So what do products or services of this scope go for in general? Or what are general compensation rates for this position in this geography for this size company? And so on. So gather as much external information that you can benchmark against as possible. And then finally, alter the process in your favor. And there's lots of ways to do this, right? You can do it on your turf. You can do it at a time of day that really works for you. You can, I don't know, if you're inclined to, you can keep the room really warm. You've heard all those types of things, right? But in general, stack the deck in your favor. Have your team there, have it in a place, in a location, a time, a setting that works for you. And then take all these steps and get to the table and negotiate the deal. So lastly, I encourage you to think about, how does this apply to you? So, we talked about some distributive negotiations, integrative negotiations, concepts like BATNA, ZOPA, reservation price. We talked about how to consider each of those things. And then we talked about some of the steps to prepare. So take a minute and jot a few things down. Maybe you've got a negotiation coming up that's high stakes, or maybe it's not, which is a great one to practice on. But go through the steps we talked about, prepare for the negotiation. And if it works out for you, I'd love for you to let me know how it goes. So you can find me on LinkedIn, or just email me at jtorrens@syr.edu. I love hearing stories of how my students perform in negotiations after learning a couple of quick techniques. So thank you very much, and good luck in your negotiations going forward.